The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table, as I watched my son David lean forward, his arm protectively wrapped around her shoulders. Ashley's emerald dress caught the light as she smiled that practiced smile I'd grown to despise over the past 2 years. The family dining room, where 3 generations of Blackwood women had hosted Christmas dinners, felt smaller tonight with tension thick enough to cut with the silver carving knife that lay untouched beside the roast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and at 78 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal life could offer. I was wrong. The woman sitting across from me, picking at her salmon with manicured nails that probably cost more than most people's grocery bills, had just delivered the most devastating blow of my long life. But she had no idea what was coming for her. None of them did. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been in my rose garden behind the Blackwood estate, deadheading the last blooms of autumn. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke from chimneys throughout Millbrook Heights, the wealthy enclave where my late husband Richard had built our legacy 45 years ago. I'd been thinking about winterizing the garden when I heard voices drifting from the open library window above me. David's voice, deeper now at 42 than when he'd been the boy who used to help me plant bulbs in this very garden. And Ashley's laugh, the sharp sound that always reminded me of ice cracking. I'd learned to recognize that laugh over the 2 years since David had brought her home, announcing she was the love of his life, and they were moving in together. 2 years of watching my son transform from the thoughtful man I'd raised into someone I barely recognized. I bent closer to the rose bush, my gardening shears forgotten in my hands, as their conversation became clearer. They were discussing something that made my blood run cold in my veins. "The trust fund documents are in the safe," Ashley was saying, her voice carrying that confident tone she used when she thought she was being clever. "Once we're married, everything changes. Your mother won't be able to control the money anymore." "I know, but she's not going to just hand everything over," David replied, and I heard papers rustling. "Mother's sharper than people think. She built half of Father's business empire after he died. Please." Ashley's voice dripped with disdain. "She's an old woman playing dress-up in a house that's too big for her. Once we're married, and she realizes she has no choice but to accept me, she'll come around, especially when she understands the alternative." My fingers tightened around the pruning shears. "Alternative? What alternative?" "What do you mean?" David asked, and I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I mean, darling, that lonely old women sometimes have accidents. They fall downstairs, they forget to turn off the gas, they get confused about their medications." Ashley's voice remained conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. "It would be such a tragedy, but these things happen when elderly people insist on living alone in houses full of stairs and sharp corners." The pruning shears fell from my numb fingers, clattering against the flagstone path. I pressed my back against the garden wall, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain they could hear it 3 stories up. My own son's girlfriend had just suggested murdering me, and David hadn't said a word to stop her. "Ashley, you can't be serious," David finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm serious about us having the life we deserve," she replied smoothly. "Your mother has been sitting on a fortune for 15 years while we struggle to make ends meet. Do you know what I could do with even a fraction of that money? The connections I could make, the opportunities we could create." Struggle to make ends meet. I nearly laughed despite my terror. David earned more in a year as a corporate lawyer than most families saw in a decade, and Ashley's trust fund from her own family wasn't exactly pocket change. But apparently it wasn't enough. It was never enough for people like her. "The will reading is next week," David said quietly. "We'll know more after that." "The will reading is exactly why we need to move fast," Ashley snapped, her voice losing its honeyed tone. "What if she's left everything to charity? What if there are conditions we don't know about?" "No, David, we need to control this situation before it controls us." I heard footsteps moving across the library floor, and I forced myself to move, walking carefully along the garden path toward the greenhouse, where I could think without being seen from the house. My legs felt unsteady, and not just from my 78 years. I'd survived my husband's death, built his struggling architecture firm into one of the most successful in the state, and raised a son who I thought shared my values. Now that same son was discussing my death as if it were a business transaction. The greenhouse smelled like earth and growing things, comforting scents that usually calmed my mind. I sank onto the wooden bench, where Richard used to sit and plan his garden designs, trying to process what I'd just heard. Ashley wanted me dead for my money, and David seemed willing to consider it. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. But beneath the hurt, something else was growing. Anger, pure crystalline rage that burned away the shock and left me thinking clearly for the first time in weeks. If Ashley thought she could manipulate my son into murdering me, she was about to learn exactly how wrong she could be. I'd been Eleanor Blackwood for 53 years, wife to Richard Blackwood and mother to David. But before that I'd been Eleanor Chen, daughter of immigrants who'd built their American dream from nothing. I'd learned early that the world could be cruel to those it saw as weak, and I'd spent my entire life proving that strength came in many forms. Ashley was about to discover that this old woman had more fight left in her than anyone imagined. That evening I called my attorney Marcus Webb at his home. Marcus had been handling the Blackwood family legal affairs for over 20 years, and his voice carried concern when he heard the tension in mine. "Eleanor, you sound upset. Is everything all right? I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And Marcus, I need you to bring every document related to my will, the trust funds, and David's inheritance." "Of course. Can you give me some idea of what this is about?" I looked toward the library window, where warm light spilled out into the gathering darkness. David and Ashley were probably still up there, planning my demise over brandy and the financial documents they thought would soon be theirs. "Let's just say I've learned some things about my son that require immediate action," I said. "And Marcus, I need this kept absolutely confidential. No one can know we're meeting." The next morning, I drove into downtown Millbrook in my silver Lexus, the same car Richard had bought me for our 40th anniversary. The autumn leaves crunched under my tires as I pulled into the parking garage beneath Marcus's office building. I dressed carefully in my navy Chanel suit, the one that made me feel armor-plated and ready for battle. Marcus's office occupied the entire top floor of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the town Richard and I had helped build. Marcus himself was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of calm demeanor that made even the most complicated legal problems seem manageable. "Eleanor," he said, rising from behind his desk as his secretary showed me in. "You look lovely as always, but I can see something's troubling you." I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, noting how he'd arranged several thick folders in front of him. Always prepared, Marcus was. It was one of the qualities that had made him so successful. "I need to know exactly what David stands to inherit when I die," I said, without preamble. "Everything, the house, the business, the investments, all of it." Marcus opened the first folder, his expression growing serious. "As things stand now, David inherits virtually everything. The estate is worth approximately $47 million, including the house, your late husband's business, the investment portfolio, and various other assets. $47 million. No wonder Ashley's eyes had been shining when she talked about controlling the money. It was more than enough to fund whatever lifestyle she had in mind. "What about conditions or restrictions?" I asked. "Currently there are very few. David receives everything outright upon your death, with no requirement that he maintain the family business or the house. He could sell everything the day after the funeral if he chose to." I thought about the family business Richard had built from nothing, the architectural firm that had designed half the buildings in Millbrook and employed over 200 people. David had worked there for a few years after law school, but had left to pursue corporate law, claiming he wanted to make his own way in the world. Now it seemed he was quite willing to inherit what his father had built, even if it meant my death. "Marcus, I want to change my will. Completely." His eyebrows rose slightly. "That's certainly your right, Eleanor. What kind of changes are you considering?" I pulled out a notebook where I'd spent the previous evening writing down my thoughts. "First, I want to establish a charitable foundation, the Eleanor and Richard Blackwood Foundation for Educational Excellence. I want to endow it with $30 million. Marcus began taking notes, his pen moving quickly across his legal pad. That's very generous, Eleanor. Educational causes. Scholarships for students from immigrant families, funding for public school arts programs, support for adult education initiatives. The kind of programs Richard and I always believed in. I paused, thinking of my parents who'd sacrificed everything so I could get an education. I want the foundation to be managed by a board of trustees, with no family members eligible to serve. Understood. What about the remaining assets? The house and the business go into a preservation trust. They can never be sold or substantially altered. The house will become a museum, showcasing the architectural heritage of Millbrook, and the business will continue operating as a worker-owned cooperative. Marcus looked up from his notes. Eleanor, that's a radical departure from your current will. David would inherit very little under this arrangement. David will inherit exactly what he's earned, I said firmly. Which, based on recent conversations I've overheard, is nothing. I told Marcus everything I'd heard in the garden, watching his expression grow darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor, if what you've told me is accurate, you may be in physical danger. Have you considered going to the police? With what? Overheard conversations that could be dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of an elderly woman. No, Marcus. The best defense against Ashley's plans is to make sure my death won't benefit her in any way.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
In fact, I want to make sure it actively works against her. What do you mean? I smiled, feeling more like myself than I had in months. I want to add a clause to the will. If David marries Ashley Chen within 5 years of my death, or if he dies under suspicious circumstances within that same time frame, the entire inheritance goes to charity, every penny. Marcus's pen had stopped moving. Eleanor, that's a very unusual provision. These are very unusual circumstances. Can you draft it in a way that would hold up in court? I can draft it, but Eleanor, you should consider the implications. You're essentially disinheriting your only child based on your disapproval of his relationship. I'm protecting myself and ensuring that my life's work goes to worthy causes instead of funding the lifestyle of a woman who wants me dead. I leaned forward in my chair. Marcus, I spent 50 years building this fortune alongside my husband. I won't let it be stolen by someone who sees murder as a convenient business strategy. He nodded slowly. When do you want this completed? As soon as possible. And Marcus, I want the will reading moved up. Send invitations for this Friday evening at the house. Tell David it's for the quarterly family trust review. Something routine. You want to tell them about the changes immediately. I want Ashley to understand exactly what she'll lose if anything happens to me, and I want David to see what his choices have cost him. That afternoon, I went to see my friend Margaret Santos, who lived in the estate next to mine. Margaret and I had been friends for 30 years, ever since her husband Carlos had started his importing business, and they'd moved to Millbrook Heights. She was one of the few people I trusted completely, and I needed an ally. Margaret was in her kitchen when I arrived, preparing ingredients for one of her famous dinner parties. At 75, she was still the most energetic person I knew, with silver hair that gleamed like spun metal and dark eyes that missed nothing. Eleanor, darling, she said, looking up from a cutting board full of vegetables. You look like someone stole your favorite rose bush. What's wrong? I told her everything, from the overheard conversation to my meeting with Marcus that morning. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing more outraged with each detail. That little witch, she said when I finished. I never liked her, you know. Too smooth, too calculating. But David seemed so smitten, I thought maybe I was being unfair. You weren't being unfair. Your instincts were right, as usual. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face me fully. What can I do to help? I need witnesses for Friday evening. People who can verify what happens during the will reading. People Ashley can't intimidate or buy off. Consider it done. Carlos and I will be there, and I'll make sure Dr. Patterson comes too. He's always looking for an excuse to leave the hospital early on Fridays. Dr. Patterson was Margaret's neighbor on the other side, a retired surgeon who'd become something of a family friend over the years. He had the kind of steady presence that would be invaluable if Ashley decided to cause a scene. There's something else, I said. I need you to keep an eye on the house over the next few days. If anything happens to me before Friday, anything at all, I need you to call the police immediately and tell them about this conversation." Margaret's face paled. "Eleanor, you don't really think she'd try something before the will reading, do you?" "I think Ashley is desperate enough to try anything, but knowing that witnesses are watching might make her think twice." Over the next few days, I made my preparations with the methodical care Richard had always admired. I installed new security cameras around the house, using a company that offered cloud storage so the footage couldn't be easily destroyed. I updated my medical information with Dr. Patterson, making sure he had copies of all my prescriptions and medical history in case there were any questions about my health. Most importantly, I spent time with the staff who'd worked for the Blackwood family for years. Maria, our housekeeper, had been with us for 20 years. James, the groundskeeper, had maintained our gardens for 15. They knew me well enough to notice if my behavior changed suddenly, and I wanted them to be aware that something might happen. "Mrs. Blackwood," Maria said as she helped me plan the refreshments for Friday evening, "you seem worried about something. Is there anything I can do?" Maria was a sharp woman in her 50s, who'd raised 4 children while working for our family. She had the kind of protective instincts that made her notice when something was wrong. "I'm just concerned about some family business," I said carefully. "If anything seems unusual over the next few days, I want you to call Dr. Patterson immediately. Can you do that for me?" Her dark eyes searched my face. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood. You can count on me." Thursday evening, I had dinner alone in the smaller dining room, the one where Richard and I used to eat when it was just the two of us. David was working late, he'd said, though I suspected he was actually with Ashley planning whatever they thought would happen after the will reading. They probably expected to learn about their inheritance and start making plans for their new life. Instead, they were about to discover that their schemes had cost them everything. I was finishing my dessert when I heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, I saw David's BMW pulling up to the front entrance. A moment later, I heard his key in the lock and his footsteps in the foyer. "Mother," he called. "Are you home?" "In the dining room, dear," I replied, my voice steady. He appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie with one hand. Even in the lamplight, I could see the stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. Whatever Ashley was putting him through, it was taking its toll. "How was your day?" I asked. The same question I'd been asking him since he was a child. "Long, complicated." He sat down across from me, accepting the cup of coffee Maria brought without being asked. "Mother, about tomorrow evening, Ashley mentioned she might stop by." "Oh?" I kept my voice neutral. "I thought this was just a family meeting." "It is, but she's practically family now, isn't she? We're talking about getting engaged soon." Engaged. The word hit me like a physical blow, though I managed not to show it. Once they were engaged, Ashley would push harder for a quick wedding, and once they were married, I would become nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "I see," I said. "Well, she's certainly welcome to attend, if you think it's appropriate." David looked surprised by my easy agreement. "Really? I thought you might object." "David, you're a grown man. If Ashley is important to you, then I suppose I should make an effort to include her in family matters." He smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, and for a moment I saw the boy he'd been before ambition and Ashley had changed him. "Thank you, Mother. That means a lot to me." After he left, I sat in the dining room for a long time, looking at the family portraits that lined the walls. Generations of Blackwoods and Chens, people who'd worked hard and built something meaningful with their lives. Tomorrow evening, I would ensure that their legacy wasn't destroyed by greed and murder. Friday afternoon, I dressed with particular care. I chose my black Armani dress, the one Richard had always said made me look like a queen. I pinned my grandmother's pearl brooch to the lapel, and wore the diamond earrings Richard had given me for our 25th anniversary. If this was going to be a battle, I wanted to look like someone who was used to winning them. Marcus arrived at 5 o'clock with his briefcase and a solemn expression. I met him in the library, where the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows and illuminated the room where Richard had spent so many evenings planning his projects. "Everything is ready," Marcus said, setting his briefcase on the mahogany desk. "Are you certain you want to go through with this?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." At 6 o'clock, Our guests began arriving. Margaret and Carlos came first, followed by Dr. Patterson. David appeared promptly at 6:15, wearing his best suit and looking nervous. Ashley arrived with him, resplendent in a red dress that probably cost more than Maria made in a month. "Mrs. Blackwood," Ashley said, offering her cheek for an air kiss. "Thank you so much for including me in your family meeting. I know how important these traditions are to you." "Of course, dear," I replied. "After all, if you're going to be part of the family, you should understand how our affairs are conducted." We gathered in the library, with Marcus taking his place behind the desk, and the rest of us arranged in the comfortable chairs Richard had chosen for their combination of elegance and practicality. I watched Ashley's eyes take in the oil paintings, the first edition books, the Persian rugs that had been in Richard's family for generations. She was probably calculating their value, planning which pieces she'd keep and which she'd sell. "As you all know," Marcus began, "Eleanor asked me to review the current status of the Blackwood family trust and estate planning. There have been some recent changes that affect the distribution of assets." David leaned forward slightly. "Changes?" "Yes. Eleanor has updated her will significantly." Marcus opened his folder and withdrew the new documents. "The primary change involves the establishment of the Eleanor and Richard Blackwood Foundation for Educational Excellence, which will receive the majority of the estate's assets." I watched Ashley's face carefully. Her smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes. "That's wonderful, Mother," David said. "You and Father always believed in education." "The foundation will receive $30 million, Marcus continued. "The remaining assets, including this house and Blackwood Architectural, will be placed in preservation trusts to ensure their continued operation for the benefit of the community." Now Ashley's smile was beginning to crack around the edges. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice still sweet but with an edge of steel underneath. "What exactly does David inherit under this new arrangement?" Marcus glanced at me, and I nodded for him to continue. "David will receive a trust fund of $500,000, payable over 10 years. The principal cannot be accessed early, and the payments cease if certain conditions are violated." The silence in the room was profound. David's face had gone white, and Ashley looked like she'd been slapped. $500,000, David said finally. "Out of a $47 million estate. The bulk of the estate will go to causes your father and I believed in," I said calmly. "Education, preservation of architectural heritage, community development, the things that matter." Ashley stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "This is insane. David is your only child. You can't just give away his inheritance to strangers." "I can do whatever I choose with my own money," I replied, "and I choose to ensure it goes to worthy causes rather than funding the lifestyle of someone who sees murder as a business strategy." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Ashley's face went from pale to scarlet in the space of a heartbeat. "What are you talking about?" David demanded. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 78 years, but also feeling more powerful than I had in months. "I'm talking about the conversation you and Ashley had in this very room last week. The one where she suggested that lonely old women sometimes have accidents. The one where she discussed the various ways I might conveniently die so you could inherit my money." David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Mother, we weren't serious." "Oh, but she was serious. Weren't you, Ashley?" I turned to face her directly. "You've been planning my murder for weeks, haven't you? Calculating how much you could steal from my dead body." Ashley's mask finally came off completely. "You meddling old witch," she snarled. "You've been spying on us, haven't you? Listening at doors like some pathetic servant." "I've been protecting myself from a woman who wants me dead," I said calmly, "and ensuring that my death, whenever it comes naturally, won't benefit you in any way." "You can't do this," Ashley said, stepping closer to me with her hands clenched into fists. "I won't let you destroy everything David and I have planned. You destroyed it yourself the moment you started planning my murder." I remained perfectly still, knowing that Margaret and Dr. Patterson were witnessing every word. "But there's more, Ashley. There's a special clause just for you." Her eyes narrowed. "What kind of clause?" Marcus cleared his throat. "If David marries Ashley Chen within 5 years of Eleanor's death, or if Eleanor dies under suspicious circumstances during that time frame, David forfeits his entire inheritance. Every penny goes to charity." The color drained from Ashley's face so quickly I thought she might faint. You can't do that. It's not legal. It's perfectly legal, Marcus said firmly. And it's ironclad. I made sure of that. Ashley spun around to face David, her voice rising to a shriek. Say something. Don't just sit there while she ruins our lives. David was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock certainly, hurt probably. But underneath it all, I thought I saw something that might have been shame. Mother, he said quietly. Did you really hear us talking about hurting you? I heard Ashley suggest that I might have an accident, David. I heard her talk about confused elderly women who forget to turn off the gas or fall downstairs. And I heard you fail to stop her. He closed his eyes. I thought she was just frustrated. I didn't think she meant it. She meant every word, I said. And if you can't see that, then you're not the man I raised you to be. Ashley was looking around the room like a trapped animal, her breath coming in short gasps. This isn't over, she said finally. I'll contest the will. I'll prove you're mentally incompetent. I'll find a way to break this. Good luck with that, Dr. Patterson said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. I examined Eleanor just yesterday. She's in perfect mental health, sharper than people half her age. Any competency challenge would fail miserably. Besides, Margaret added with a smile that could have cut glass, we've all witnessed this conversation. I doubt any court would be sympathetic to someone who's been caught planning murder. Ashley looked around the room one more time, her eyes wild with rage and desperation. Then she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. Ashley, wait, David called, starting to rise from his chair. She whirled around to face him. Wait for what? For you to grow a spine. For your mother to change her mind. It's over, David. Your family has made it clear that I'm not welcome here. Ashley, please, we can work this out. No, we can't. Her voice was ice cold now. Your mother just destroyed our future, and you're sitting there like a beaten dog. I won't waste another minute of my life on a man who can't even stand up to his own mother. She stormed out of the library, her heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. A moment later, we heard the front door slam and her car starting in the driveway. David sat in his chair, his head in his hands. Mother, I don't know what to say. You could start with an explanation, I said. How did you get involved with a woman like that? He was quiet for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. She was so confident, so ambitious. She made me feel like I could be more than I was. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of who I actually wanted to be. And what about her suggestions regarding my health and safety? I thought she was just venting. People say things when they're frustrated that they don't really mean. David, she was planning my murder. There's a difference between venting and plotting to kill someone for their money. He nodded slowly. I see that now. I should have seen it before. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of everything that had happened settling over the room like dust after an explosion. Finally, David looked up at me with something approaching his old self in his eyes. Is there any way to fix this, Mother? Any way to earn back your trust? I studied my son's face, looking for the boy I'd raised and the man I'd hoped he would become. That depends entirely on you, David. Trust is earned through actions, not words. What would you need to see? I thought about it carefully. This was the moment that would determine whether David and I had any kind of future relationship, whether the Blackwood family could heal from this betrayal. I need to see that you understand what you almost lost, I said finally. Not the money, David. You almost lost yourself. You almost became the kind of person who would stand by while someone planned murder for profit. He nodded. I understand that now. I also need to see that you're committed to building something meaningful with your life, not just accumulating wealth and status. What do you mean? Your father built Blackwood Architectural to create beautiful functional spaces that would last for generations. He hired people from the community and paid them well. He donated his services to build libraries and schools and community centers. That's what I mean by meaningful work. David was quiet for a moment. Are you saying you want me to come back to the firm? I'm saying I want you to think about what kind of legacy you want to leave, what kind of man you want to be. Over the next several weeks, David and I began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship. He broke up with Ashley definitively. changing his phone number and even moving to a new apartment when she refused to accept that their relationship was over. He started therapy to understand how he'd lost his way so completely. Most importantly, he began volunteering with literacy programs in the community, working with adult learners who reminded him of his grandparents and their struggle to build a life in America. I watched him rediscover the compassion and sense of purpose that Ashley had nearly destroyed. 2 months after the will reading, Marcus called with interesting news. Ashley had indeed tried to contest the will, claiming I was mentally incompetent, and that David had been coerced into accepting the new terms. But her lawyer had dropped the case after Dr. Patterson submitted his evaluation, and Margaret provided testimony about Ashley's threats. She's also been investigated by the police, Marcus told me. Apparently she made some threats against you that concerned her former attorney enough to report them. What kind of threats? Let's just say she didn't take the loss of the inheritance well, but there's no evidence she acted on any of them, and she's apparently left town. David probably dodged a bullet there. A year later, David rejoined Blackwood Architectural as a junior partner, bringing his legal expertise to help the firm navigate complex commercial projects. He'd also started dating Maria's daughter Elena, a teacher who shared his newfound commitment to community service. Watching them together, I could see the man he was becoming, and I felt hopeful about his future for the first time in years. As for my will, I made one small change. David's inheritance increased to $5 million, still a fraction of the total estate but enough to ensure his security. The rest would still go to the foundation and the preservation trusts, ensuring that the values Richard and I had shared would outlive us both. But the clause about Ashley remained, just in case. On a warm spring evening, I sat in my rose garden with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The roses Richard had planted were blooming again, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear David and Elena laughing as they walked along the garden paths. I thought about Ashley sometimes, wondering where she'd ended up and whether she'd found another wealthy family to target. But mostly I felt grateful. Grateful that I'd discovered her true nature before it was too late. Grateful that David had found his way back to the values we'd tried to instill in him. Grateful for the life Richard and I had built together, and the legacy we would leave behind. The will reading that night had revealed more than just the contents of legal documents. It had revealed the true character of everyone in that room. Ashley had shown herself to be exactly what I'd suspected, a woman who saw murder as an acceptable means to an end. David had shown that he was still capable of change, still capable of becoming the man he was meant to be. And I had shown that Eleanor Blackwood was not a woman to be underestimated, no matter her age. I had fought for my life, my legacy, and my family's future, and I had won. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I raised my teacup in a silent toast to Richard, to the future, and to the power of a well-written will to reveal the truth about the people we love. The morning after Ashley's dramatic exit brought an unusual silence to the Blackwood estate. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the gardeners tend to the fall cleanup, their movements methodical and peaceful in the crisp October air. For the first time in months, I felt truly secure in my own home. The immediate threat was gone, but I knew the real work was just beginning. David appeared at my door around 10 o'clock, looking like he hadn't slept much. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and regret. "Mother, may I come in?" I gestured to the sitting area by the window where Richard and I used to have our morning coffee when he was alive. David sat heavily in Richard's old chair, an irony that wasn't lost on either of us. "I keep thinking about last night," he began, his voice hoarse. "About everything Ashley said, everything she planned. I can't believe I was so blind." "Love can make people blind, David, but so can greed and ambition." He winced at my words. "Is that what you think it was? Greed?" I studied my son's face, looking for signs of the boy I'd raised alongside the man he'd become. "I think Ashley offered you a vision of yourself that was very appealing. Successful, wealthy, important. But somewhere along the way, you forgot to ask what the cost would be. The cost was almost your life." His voice broke slightly. "Mother, I need you to know that I never would have let her hurt you. I may have been foolish, but I would never have allowed that. But you didn't stop her when she suggested it. I didn't take her seriously. I thought she was just fantasizing, venting her frustrations. I never imagined she would actually plan something like that. I poured myself a cup of tea from the service Maria had brought up earlier, the familiar ritual giving me time to consider my response. David Ashley spent weeks calculating the value of my death. She researched the legal requirements for inheritance, studied the layout of this house, looking for opportunities to stage an accident, and cultivated relationships with people who could help her execute her plan. That wasn't fantasy or frustration. That was premeditation. The color drained from his face. How do you know all that? Because after I overheard your conversation, I had Marcus hire a private investigator. Ashley's computer search history makes for very disturbing reading. Websites about accidental poisoning, forums discussing how to make falls look like accidents, even research into which medications could cause fatal interactions with my heart prescription. David buried his face in his hands. Dear God, I brought a murderer into our home. You brought someone into our home who you thought you loved. The fact that she turned out to be a sociopath isn't entirely your fault, but your willingness to ignore the warning signs is something you need to understand about yourself. He looked up at me, his eyes desperate. How do I make this right, Mother? How do I earn back your trust? Time will tell, David, but I can give you a starting point. Over the next hour, I outlined what I expected from him. Complete transparency about his relationship with Ashley, including how they'd met and how she'd gradually isolated him from his friends and family. A commitment to therapy to understand how he'd become so susceptible to manipulation. Most importantly, a return to the values Richard and I had tried to instill in him. I want you to take a leave of absence from your firm. I told him, come work with me on the foundation. Learn what it means to build something that matters more than profit. You'd trust me with that after everything that's happened. I'd trust you to learn from your mistakes. The question is whether you're willing to do the work required to rebuild who you are. He nodded slowly. I'll do whatever it takes. Good. Because Ashley may be gone, but the investigation into her activities is just beginning. The private investigator Marcus had hired, a former police detective named Sarah Morrison, had uncovered a pattern that went far beyond Ashley's plans for me. Over the past 5 years, Ashley had been involved with 3 other wealthy older men, all of whom had died under circumstances that were ruled accidental but had benefited her financially. Her first victim was a real estate developer in Chicago. Sarah explained during our meeting the following week. 72 years old, no close family, worth about $12 million. He fell down the stairs in his penthouse apartment 3 months after changing his will to include Ashley as a beneficiary. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was there an investigation? Cursory. He was elderly, had been drinking, lived alone. The police ruled it accidental death. Sarah consulted her notes. The second was a retired surgeon in Phoenix. Heart attack while swimming in his pool. Again ruled natural causes, but he'd recently added Ashley to his life insurance policy as his beneficiary. And the third, a widowed businessman in Seattle. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace. Ashley had been staying with him for several months, helping him manage his medication and household affairs. David had gone completely white. She killed 3 people. I can't prove that in court, Sarah said carefully. But the pattern is unmistakable. Ashley Chen is a serial killer who targets wealthy older men, and occasionally their family members when they stand in the way of her inheritance. The investigation expanded rapidly once law enforcement became involved. Within 2 weeks, detectives from 3 states were coordinating their efforts, and Ashley's carefully constructed identity began to unravel. Her real name was Ashley Brennan, and she had a criminal history dating back to her teens, including fraud, theft and assault charges that had been sealed when she was a juvenile. She's been using false identities for years, Detective Williams from the Millbrook Police explained during one of our interviews. Ashley Chen, Ashley Taylor, Ashley Martinez. She creates new personas for each target, complete with fabricated backgrounds and social media profiles. How did she meet David? I asked. Through a professional networking event. She'd been researching your family for months, studying David's habits and interests. The meeting wasn't accidental. The revelation that Ashley had specifically targeted our family, that she'd studied us like prey before moving in for the kill, made my blood run cold. but it also validated every instinct I'd had about her from the beginning. Meanwhile, Ashley had disappeared completely. Her apartment had been cleared out, her car abandoned at the airport, and all her financial accounts closed. She'd planned for the possibility of exposure and had an escape route ready. She's probably already assuming a new identity, Detective Williams warned us. Someone like this doesn't stop until she's caught or killed. She'll find another target, probably in another state. The knowledge that Ashley was still out there, still hunting for her next victim, haunted me. But I took comfort in knowing that our story was being shared with law enforcement agencies across the country. Other families would be warned. Other potential victims might be saved. As the weeks passed, David threw himself into his rehabilitation with the same intensity he'd once brought to his legal career. He attended therapy twice a week, volunteered with literacy programs in the city, and spent long hours learning about the foundation work I'd planned. I'm beginning to understand what Father saw in architecture, he told me one evening, as we reviewed applications for educational grants. It's not just about building structures, it's about creating spaces where people can grow and thrive. That's exactly what he believed, I said. Every school, every library, every community center he designed was meant to improve people's lives. David was also working to repair the relationships Ashley had damaged during their time together. She'd systematically isolated him from his college friends, his colleagues at the law firm, even his cousin Jennifer, who lived across the country. Rebuilding those connections was slow work, but David approached it with genuine humility. I need to understand how I let someone control me so completely, he said during one of our evening talks. My therapist says it's a process called love bombing, followed by gradual isolation. Ashley made me feel like the most important person in the world, then slowly convinced me that everyone else in my life was jealous or didn't understand our relationship, including me, especially you. She said you were possessive, that you couldn't accept that I'd found someone who loved me more than you did. He shook his head. I can't believe I bought into that manipulation. Ashley was very skilled at what she did, David. You weren't her first victim, and if we hadn't stopped her, you wouldn't have been her last. 3 months after the will reading, we received news that Ashley had been arrested in Miami. She'd been living under the name Ashley Rodriguez and had become engaged to a 75-year-old retired banker. The man's daughter had become suspicious when Ashley tried to rush him into changing his will, and a background check had revealed her true identity. She's being charged with fraud and attempted murder in Florida, Detective Williams informed us. But with the evidence we've gathered from the other cases, we're hoping to build a federal case for multiple homicides. The trial, when it finally came to court 8 months later, was a media sensation. Ashley's victims' families testified about the warning signs they'd missed, the gradual changes in their loved ones' behavior, the convenient timing of the deaths. David testified about her threats against me and her detailed planning for my murder. I testified about the conversation I'd overheard in the garden, about the fear I'd lived with for weeks, and about the measures I'd taken to protect myself. When the prosecutor asked me to describe the moment I realized my son's girlfriend was planning to kill me, I looked directly at Ashley, who sat at the defendant's table with the same composed expression she'd worn to so many family dinners. I realized that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatics, I said. Sometimes it wears a beautiful dress and speaks in a pleasant voice. Sometimes it sits at your dinner table and discusses murder like it's a business transaction. Ashley was convicted on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and fraud. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led her away in shackles, she looked back at David one last time, her expression cold and calculating even in defeat. "You chose me over her," she called out, her voice echoing in the courtroom. "Remember that." But David didn't flinch. He'd grown too much in the past year to be manipulated by her words. The man sitting beside me in that courtroom was someone I barely recognized as the son who'd brought Ashley home 2 years earlier. He was stronger, more grounded, more connected to his own values than he'd been in years. After the trial, David and I returned to Millbrook and the quiet work of building the foundation. We'd received over 3,000 applications for educational grants in our first year, from students pursuing everything from nursing degrees to doctoral programs in engineering. Reading their stories, understanding their dreams and struggles, reminded me why Richard and I had worked so hard to build our fortune in the first place. "This is what wealth should do," David said one afternoon, as we reviewed scholarship applications. "It should create opportunities for people who need them." "Your father would be proud of the man you've become," I told him. "I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it." David had also begun dating again, though very cautiously. Elena Santos, Maria's daughter, was an elementary school teacher who shared David's newfound commitment to community service. She was patient with his healing process, understanding about his need to rebuild trust slowly. "She's nothing like Ashley," David told me after he'd been seeing Elena for several months. "Elena challenges me to be better, but she doesn't try to change who I am fundamentally. She makes me want to be the best version of myself, not someone else entirely." Watching them together, I could see the difference. Where Ashley had been possessive and manipulative, Elena was supportive and encouraging. Where Ashley had isolated David from his family and friends, Elena insisted that he maintain those relationships. Where Ashley had focused on what she could gain from the relationship, Elena focused on what they could build together. The foundation flourished beyond my wildest expectations. By the end of our second year, we'd awarded over $4 million in scholarships and grants. We'd funded after-school programs in underserved communities, supported adult literacy initiatives, and helped establish community gardens in urban neighborhoods. More importantly, the work had given David a sense of purpose he'd been missing for years. He'd discovered a talent for connecting with young people, for understanding their challenges and helping them navigate the system to achieve their goals. "I think I understand now why you were so angry about Ashley's plans," he told me one evening as we worked late in the foundation office. "It wasn't just about the money, it was about destroying something meaningful to build something empty." Exactly. Ashley would have used our wealth to buy status symbols and experiences for herself. Instead, we're using it to create opportunities for others. And the preservation trusts. The house will become a museum showcasing Millbrook's architectural heritage. Blackwood Architectural will continue as a worker-owned cooperative, ensuring that Father's employees share in the company's success. The work will continue long after we're gone. On the third anniversary of that terrible night when I'd overheard Ashley's murder plot, I stood again in my rose garden, but this time I wasn't alone. David and Elena were there, along with Margaret and Carlos, Dr. Patterson, and several of the scholarship recipients who'd become like extended family to me. We were celebrating the engagement David had announced that morning. Elena's ring had belonged to my mother, a simple but elegant design that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. Seeing it on her finger felt like a blessing from the past and a promise for the future. "I have something to tell you all," I said as we gathered around the garden table where Maria had laid out a feast of Elena's favorite foods. "I've made one final change to my will." David looked startled. "Mother, you don't need to. I want to." I pulled out the document Marcus had prepared the week before. "David's inheritance has been increased to $10 million. Elena, you've been added as a beneficiary for $5 million. The rest will still go to the foundation and the preservation trusts, but I wanted you both to know that you'll be secure." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Blackwood, I don't know what to say. Say you'll use it wisely. Say you'll remember that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege." "We will," David promised. "And Mother, thank you, not just for the money, but for fighting for our family when I was too blind to see what was happening." "I fought for all of us," I said. "For the past we'd built and the future we deserved." As the evening wore on and our guests shared stories and laughter, I thought about Ashley sitting in her prison cell, cut off from the world she'd tried so hard to manipulate. I wondered if she ever thought about the lives she'd destroyed in pursuit of money that could never have filled the emptiness inside her. But mostly, I felt grateful for the warning that had saved my life and my family's legacy. Grateful for a son who'd been strong enough to change when change was necessary. Grateful for the opportunity to build something meaningful with the years I had left. The preservation clause about Ashley remained in my will, of course, not because I expected her to escape from prison, but because some precautions should never be removed. Evil, I'd learned, was patient and persistent. It was important to remain vigilant. Dr. Patterson approached me as the party was winding down. "Eleanor, I have to ask, how did you know?" What made you suspicious of Ashley before you overheard that conversation? I considered his question carefully. Little things, mostly. The way she studied the house, like she was cataloging inventory. How she asked detailed questions about my health and daily routines. The way she isolated David from his friends and family. But mostly, it was her eyes. Her eyes, they were cold, calculating. When she looked at me, I didn't see affection or even polite interest. I saw someone doing math, figuring out how long she'd have to wait for me to die naturally and whether it was worth accelerating the timeline. And you decided to fight back. I decided to protect what mattered. This house, the business Richard built, the family legacy, David's future. Ashley saw all of that as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. I couldn't let her win. As I locked up the house that night, I walked through each room, touching the furniture Richard and I had chosen together, looking at the photographs that told the story of our life together. In the library, I paused at the desk where Marcus had read my revised will that night 3 years ago, where Ashley's mask had finally slipped and revealed the monster underneath. The house felt peaceful now, settled in a way it hadn't been during those terrible months when I'd lived in fear. The security cameras were still there, the medical monitoring systems still in place, but they felt less like protective measures and more like reasonable precautions. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, past the family portraits that lined the walls, generations of Blackwoods and Chens, who'd worked hard, loved deeply, and built something lasting. They'd faced their own challenges, their own threats, their own difficult choices. But they'd persevered, and their legacy continued. In my bedroom, I opened the jewelry box where I kept my most precious treasures. My wedding ring from Richard, the pearl necklace that had belonged to his grandmother, the watch my parents had given me when I graduated college. But the piece I reached for was newer, a simple silver locket David had given me for my 79th birthday. Inside was a photograph of our family at last year's foundation gala. David and Elena, Margaret and Carlos, Dr. Patterson, even Maria and her grandchildren. The family we'd built through choice and love, not just blood and obligation. The family Ashley had tried to destroy, but had only made stronger. As I settled into bed, I thought about the scholarship recipients who would graduate this year, the community programs that would break ground next spring, the architectural projects that would preserve Millbrook's heritage for future generations. All of it possible because I'd refused to let a murderer steal our legacy. The loons were calling on the lake behind Margaret's house, their voices carrying across the water in the moonlight. It was a sound that had welcomed me to this community 53 years ago when Richard and I had first moved here as newlyweds. It was a sound that promised continuity, endurance, the persistence of beautiful things in a world that often seemed bent on destroying them. I fell asleep to that sound, secure in my home, surrounded by the love of family and friends, protected by careful planning and fierce determination. Ashley Chen, or whatever name she was using now, would spend the rest of her life behind bars, paying for the lives she'd taken and the families she'd destroyed. Justice had been served, the family legacy was secure. And sometimes, that was enough. 6 months later, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Ashley, written from her federal prison cell, and forwarded through the prosecutor's office. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unread, but curiosity won out over caution. The letter was brief and written in Ashley's careful handwriting. She didn't apologize for her crimes or express remorse for the people she'd killed. Instead, she wrote about regret, about the choices that had led her to a life of manipulation and murder. "I want you to know," she wrote, "that I understand why you fought so hard to protect your family. In the end, you were willing to sacrifice everything to save the people you loved. I never learned how to love like that. Maybe if I had, things would have been different." The letter disturbed me more than I expected, not because it contained threats or attempts at manipulation, but because it suggested a level of self-awareness that made Ashley's crimes even more tragic. She'd known what love looked like, had seen it in our family, but had chosen money and power instead. I showed the letter to David, who read it with a troubled expression. "Do you think she's sincere?" he asked. "I think she's lonely and probably mentally ill," I said. "But sincerity and mental illness don't excuse murder. Ashley made her choices, and now she's living with the consequences. Should we respond? No. Ashley had her chance to choose differently. She chose to target our family, to plan my murder, to destroy other families before us. Responding to her letter would only give her what she's always wanted: attention and control over other people's emotions. I put the letter in my desk drawer, not because I wanted to keep it, but because it seemed important to remember. Evil, I'd learned, was complex and often came from people who'd been damaged themselves. But understanding the source of evil didn't mean excusing its effects or opening yourself up to further manipulation. The foundation continued to grow, expanding into new areas like job training programs and small business loans for entrepreneurs from immigrant families. David had found his calling in this work, using his legal skills to help people navigate complex systems and access opportunities they might never have known existed. Elena proved to be a natural at grant writing and program development. Her background in education helped her understand the real challenges facing students and families, while her warm personality made donors and recipients feel like partners in something important rather than just sources or recipients of charity. On my 80th birthday, the foundation hosted a celebration that filled the Blackwood estate with over 200 guests. Scholarship recipients, community partners, foundation board members, and family friends gathered to share stories about the impact our work had made in their lives. A young woman named Sarah Kim, who'd received a scholarship to study engineering, told the crowd about growing up in a family that had immigrated from Korea with nothing but determination and hope. Mrs. Blackwood's foundation didn't just pay for my education, she said. It showed me that successful people have a responsibility to lift others up. That's the kind of engineer I want to be. Another recipient, a man named Carlos Mendoza, who'd received job training funding to start his own construction business, brought his entire crew to the party. Because of this foundation, he said, I was able to learn skills that changed my family's life. But more than that, I learned that success means creating opportunities for others. Now my company hires and trains other people who need a second chance. As I listened to their stories, I thought about Ashley and her letter, about the choice between love and greed that defines so many lives. These young people had faced challenges and obstacles, but they'd chosen to build rather than destroy, to lift others up rather than tear them down. That was the real victory, I realized, not just that we'd stopped a murderer or preserved a family fortune, but that we'd used our resources to multiply opportunities for good in the world. Ashley had seen our wealth as something to be stolen and squandered. We'd transformed it into something that would create value for generations. Late that evening, after the last guests had gone home and the catering staff had cleaned up, David and Elena and I sat on the back terrace, looking out over the lake that had drawn Richard and me to this place so many years ago. I've been thinking about the future, David said. About what happens to the foundation after you're gone. The foundation will outlive all of us, I said. That's the point of endowments and professional management. But I hope you and Elena will stay involved for as long as you're able. We will, Elena promised. This work has become part of who we are. Good, because the world will always need people who understand that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. As the years passed, I watched my legacy take root and flourish in ways I'd never imagined. The foundation's scholarship recipients went on to become teachers, doctors, engineers, and entrepreneurs. Some of them started their own charitable organizations, multiplying the impact of our original investment. Others simply lived lives of integrity and service, raising children who understood the importance of community and compassion. The architectural firm continued to thrive as a worker-owned cooperative, taking on projects that balanced profitability with social responsibility. They designed affordable housing complexes, renovated historic buildings for community use, and created public spaces that brought people together, rather than dividing them. The house itself became a beloved museum and event space, hosting everything from wedding receptions, to corporate retreats, to educational programs for local schools. Visitors came from around the country to learn about Millbrook's architectural heritage and the immigrant families who'd helped build the community. On my 85th birthday, I received a letter that brought everything full circle. It was from Detective Williams, now retired, telling me about a young woman who'd contacted him after seeing a documentary about Ashley's crimes. She said her grandmother had been targeted by someone matching Ashley's description about 10 years ago, he wrote. But the grandmother had been suspicious and called the police before anything happened. Your story inspired her to speak up about what her family had experienced. We may never know how many potential victims were saved because you decided to fight back. The letter reminded me that courage is often contagious. By refusing to be a victim, by fighting for my family and my values, I'd inspired others to be vigilant and protective of their own loved ones. The ripple effects of that one terrible night when I'd overheard Ashley's murder plot continued to spread, creating safety and awareness in communities I'd never even visited. As I wrote this story, sitting in the same library where Marcus had read my revised will that night so many years ago, I reflected on the choices that had brought me to this moment. The choice to eavesdrop on a conversation that would have been easier to ignore. The choice to take threats seriously, rather than dismissing them as impossible. The choice to fight back, rather than hoping for the best. But mostly, I thought about the choice between love and fear, between building and destroying, between leaving the world better or worse than I'd found it. Ashley had chosen fear, destruction and selfishness. My family had chosen love, creation and service to others. In the end, that made all the difference. The foundation continues its work today, long after I'm gone. David and Elena raised 3 children who understood from an early age that privilege comes with responsibility. The house still stands as a testament to the immigrant families who built Millbrook. The architectural firm still creates beautiful functional spaces that improve people's lives. And somewhere in a federal prison, Ashley Chen serves her life sentence, a reminder that evil exists but doesn't have to win. She'd sneered that my son had chosen her over me, but she'd been wrong about that too. In the end, David chose the values his father and I had tried to teach him. He chose love over greed, service over selfishness, building over destroying. That choice, multiplied across thousands of scholarship recipients and community partners and family friends, became a legacy worth more than any fortune Ashley could have stolen. It became proof that sometimes, when good people stand up to evil, good people win. Years later, when journalists would ask me about that pivotal night when everything changed, I would tell them that the most important lesson I learned wasn't about recognizing evil or protecting wealth. It was about the power of preparation meeting opportunity, even when that opportunity came disguised as the worst moment of your life. The documentary that aired 5 years after Ashley's conviction brought renewed attention to our story. Producers had contacted me through the foundation office, requesting interviews about what they called a remarkable case of an elderly woman outsmarting a serial killer. I'd initially declined, preferring to let our work speak for itself, rather than reliving those dark months of fear and uncertainty. But Elena convinced me to participate. Think about all the other families who might be facing similar situations, she said, during one of our weekly dinners at the estate. Your story could save lives. She was right, of course. Elena had a gift for seeing the broader implications of personal experiences, one of the many qualities that made her perfect for David and for our family. So I agreed to the interviews, spending long afternoons with the documentary crew, walking through the house and gardens where everything had unfolded. The most difficult part was returning to the rose garden where I'd first overheard Ashley's murder plot. Standing there with the cameras rolling, I could still remember the shock of hearing my own death discussed so casually, the way my hands had trembled as I dropped the pruning shears. But I could also remember the strength that had followed, the clarity of purpose that had guided every decision afterward. People ask me if I was scared. I told the interviewer. Of course I was scared, but fear and action aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes fear is exactly what you need to motivate you to fight for what matters most. The documentary, titled The Will to Survive, premiered at film festivals before airing on national television. The response was overwhelming. The foundation received hundreds of letters from viewers, many of them elderly people who'd recognized similar patterns in their own lives or the lives of loved ones. Several police departments reported that the film had prompted investigations into suspicious deaths that had previously been ruled accidental. Most gratifying were the letters from adult children who'd reconciled with parents after recognizing how manipulation had damaged their relationships. A woman in Oregon wrote to tell me that watching David's story had inspired her to seek therapy for her own susceptibility to controlling partners. A man in Texas credited the documentary with helping him understand how his father's much younger girlfriend had been isolating him from family and friends. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from someone much closer to home. Dr. Patterson, now well into his 80s, but still sharp as ever, approached me after a foundation board meeting, about 6 months after the documentary aired. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I've been thinking about that night for years, about how close we came to losing you. But watching the documentary made me realize something I'd never considered before." "What's that, George?" "How many other women your age might be facing similar threats right now, but don't have your resources or your support system? How many elderly people are being targeted by predators who know they're unlikely to be believed or taken seriously?" His words sparked an idea that had been forming in the back of my mind since the documentary's release. Within a month, we'd established the Elder Protection Initiative as a new branch of the foundation. The program provided free legal services, safety planning, and support groups for older adults who suspected they were being targeted by financial predators or worse. David threw himself into the project with enthusiasm, using his legal expertise to create resources that helped seniors recognize warning signs and take protective action. Elena developed educational materials that could be distributed through senior centers, libraries, and community organizations. Even Maria, now officially retired but still helping with special events, contributed by conducting outreach in Spanish-speaking communities. The first support group meeting drew 12 participants, all women between the ages of 65 and 82. They shared stories that were heartbreakingly familiar: tales of adult children demanding access to financial accounts, romantic partners pushing for quick marriages and will changes, and home health aides who seemed more interested in cataloging valuable possessions than providing care. "The hardest part," said a woman named Dorothy whose nephew had been pressuring her to sell her house and move into assisted living, "is that everyone assumes you're just being paranoid. They say things like he's family's or she seems so nice, as if those things guarantee someone's honesty." Another participant, Rose, had been dating a man who'd proposed after knowing her for only 2 months. "He keeps talking about how we should combine our finances for efficiency," she said. "But when I suggested a prenuptial agreement, he got angry and said I didn't trust him." That's when I knew something was wrong. Listening to their stories, I was struck by how universal Ashley's tactics had been. The love bombing followed by isolation, the urgent timelines that prevented careful consideration. The way predators made their targets feel guilty for being cautious or seeking advice from others. "Trust your instincts," I told the group during my first visit to one of their meetings. "If something feels wrong, it probably is. You didn't survive this long by being foolish, and you don't lose your judgment just because you reach a certain age." The Elder Protection Initiative expanded rapidly, adding legal clinics, financial literacy workshops, and even a confidential hotline staffed by retired social workers and counselors. Within 2 years, we were operating in 4 states and had prevented an estimated $15 million in elder financial abuse. The work also led to unexpected collaborations. Law enforcement agencies began consulting with our staff about suspicious cases. Financial institutions started referring customers who seemed to be under undue pressure to make large transactions or account changes. Even adult protective services departments partnered with us to provide comprehensive support for vulnerable seniors. One case particularly stood out. A wealthy widow in her 70s had contacted our hotline about her live-in companion, a woman in her 30s who'd gradually taken control of the household finances and was pushing for changes to the will. Our legal team worked with local police to investigate, uncovering evidence that the companion had used similar tactics with at least 2 other elderly clients, both of whom had died under questionable circumstances. "Your program saved my life," the widow told me during a foundation gala. "Without your support, I never would have had the courage to report what was happening. I thought I was being overly suspicious." The success of the Elder Protection Initiative brought national recognition to the foundation. We received grants from federal agencies, partnerships with major philanthropic organizations, and invitations to testify before congressional committees about the scope of elder abuse in America. But the most rewarding recognition came from an unexpected source. The Federal Bureau of Investigation created an award named in my honor, the Eleanor Blackwood Award for Courage in the Face of Elder Abuse. The annual award recognized individuals who'd shown exceptional bravery in protecting themselves or others from predatory schemes. The first recipient was a 90-year-old man in Florida who'd exposed a massive financial scam targeting residents of his retirement community. The second was a home health aide in California who'd reported suspicious behavior by a colleague who was stealing from clients. Each story reminded me that courage comes in many forms and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they decide to fight for what's right. As I aged into my late 80s, I began to think more seriously about my own mortality and the final chapter of our family's story. David and Elena had established themselves as capable leaders of the foundation, bringing fresh ideas and energy to the work while maintaining the core values that had guided us from the beginning. Their children, now teenagers, had grown up understanding that wealth was a tool for creating positive change rather than simply accumulating possessions. They volunteered at foundation events, participated in scholarship selection committees, and seemed genuinely excited about continuing the family tradition of service. "I want to study nonprofit management in college," their oldest daughter, Sarah, told me during her 16th birthday celebration. "I want to understand how to make organizations like ours even more effective." Their son Michael was more interested in the architectural side of our legacy, spending hours studying the building plans and historical documents related to the Preservation Trust. "I want to design buildings that serve communities the way great-grandfathers did," he said. Even their youngest, Emily, showed signs of the family commitment to education and service. At 13, she'd already organized fundraising drives at her school for various foundation initiatives and spoke passionately about issues affecting her generation. Watching them grow and develop their own sense of purpose, I felt confident that our values would continue long after I was gone. Ashley had tried to destroy our family's legacy, but instead she'd strengthened it by forcing us to examine what truly mattered and fight for it with everything we had. The final legal chapter of Ashley's story came when she lost her last appeal and her sentence was confirmed as final. She would spend the rest of her life in federal prison, with no possibility of parole or release. The notification came through our attorney, a brief formal letter that marked the end of any lingering legal uncertainty. I felt no satisfaction in her fate, only relief that she could never again threaten another family. Justice had been served, but the real victory was in everything we'd built from the ashes of her attempt to destroy us. The foundation, the Preservation Trust, the Elder Protection Initiative, the strengthened bonds between David and Elena, and their children, all of it represented triumph over evil, love over greed, hope over fear. That evening, I sat in my rose garden one final time, surrounded by the flowers that had witnessed both the darkest and brightest moments of this long journey. The garden had changed over the years, new varieties planted alongside the original roses Richard had chosen, creating a living symbol of growth and renewal. Tomorrow, the foundation would announce its largest scholarship program yet, providing full college funding for 100 students from immigrant families. Next month, the architectural firm would break ground on a new community center designed entirely by employee owners. Next year, the Elder Protection Initiative would expand to all 50 states. Ashley had sneered that David chose her over me, but she'd been wrong about so many things. David had chosen love over manipulation, service over selfishness, building over destroying. And that choice had created ripples that would continue spreading long after all of us were gone, touching lives and creating opportunities we could never fully measure or understand. In the end, that was the most powerful revenge of all, not hurting the person who'd tried to hurt us, but proving that her vision of the world was false. People could choose compassion over cruelty, generosity over greed, hope over fear. They did choose these things, every day, in small acts and large gestures that collectively made the world a better place. The roses bloomed around me in the gathering dusk, their fragrance carrying on the evening breeze like a promise that beautiful things endure, that love persists, that the choice between good and evil is renewed with each generation, and good people, given the chance, will almost always choose well. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.